In this particular conference, I'm just going to try to give some perspective on what may or may not be so important regarding her life. And in order to do this, we have to know what's really available to us, and we also have to have a reasonable sense of reliability. Now, I'm not going to try to generate skeptics out of people, but really it's more a question of what things really are important. And that's one of the reasons why we spent the initial conferences on the value of the religious life, on the vows of the religious life, the value of suffering, and what it means to be victim. Those things are much more important than, oh, she prophesied Garcia Moreno's death on the square that's adjacent to this convent. Or, oh, did you know that Pius X was going to pronounce the Immaculate Conception and papal infallibility? Those things aren't really so important. It's not what people will turn to Our Lady of Buen Suceso for. And if you are, you're missing the boat. So, what do we have? The main source currently that we have, at least for the English-speaking world, I believe that there are other things that are written but more contemporary, but the main source that we have is a book called The Admirable Life of Mother Mariana of Jesus. It was written in 1790 by a Franciscan priest, Father Manuel Pereira. He himself has his own little story as a soldier. It's a similar story to St. Ignatius, except it wasn't the Blessed Virgin Mary that was, well, St. Ignatius was a soldier, Manuel Pereira was a soldier, and it was actually Mariana that brought Manuel Pereira to the Franciscans. Now, 1790, that is before the revolutions that were happening. You remember that we talked a little bit about many documents that were hidden in the convent, and Mariana herself testified to the bishop that, yes, later on during the history, as time unfolds, perhaps it's 100 years down the road, but a lot of these things are going to be hidden in the convent for fear of the revolution. And those things were hidden and then forgotten about. But Father Pereira was able to write his book before that. And so he did have many archival documents at his disposal. He did have the biographies of the founding mothers. He did have Mariana's biography. What we call the quadernon, or the great notebook, so to speak, which is hidden today somewhere within the convent, he had access to those things when he wrote his book. The revolutions had not yet happened, and therefore there was no reason for them to be hidden. And he used them to compose this 2-volume set, The Admirable Life of Mariana. And it's important to understand that there were other authors that, things were written by others that he also had. There were 2 other writers, Father Francisco Anguita and Father Angel Francisco Perez. They were both contemporaries of Mariana of Jesus, and Father Perez was also the confessor and director for many years. So we can imagine that his testimony is a very good one, specifically regarding the different movements of her soul. So, for example, the years of suffering or the mystical experiences and what was their context. The fact that Mariana wrote her own story That's also a big document that Father Pereira would have. She wrote her own story under obedience, and it was approved by the bishop during her lifetime. So that bishop, Pedro de Oviedo was his name, Oviedo. There are testimonials of others as well, which Father Pereira would have. For example, Father Juan of the Mother of God, he was also a director to Mariana for some years. It was Father Juan, if you remember the story, that he was speaking with Mariana of Jesus, each on their own side of the screen, and they both went into ecstasy because of the edifying things that were being discussed, and they levitated off the floor. Apparently they were looking for a couple hours for Mariana. It didn't occur to them to walk into the room and, oh, there she is, as she looks up. So that was Father Juan of the Mother of God. Also, Fra Pedro of the Conception, he also shared some mystical experiences with Mariana and also Our Lady of Buen Suceso. Our Lady of Buen Suceso appeared to him as well, informing him of the things that Mariana had seen. So it was a confirming testimonial. And then the other one, Fra Diego, one of the Franciscans, a Franciscan brother, he had a share in the experience of Mariana's first death. He was in the room. You can imagine the scene. He's in this room and the body of Mariana is laying on the table. And, he's just kind of sitting in the corner. And then all of a sudden he goes into ecstasy. He's just out of it. And the priest, gave him a kick. He said, "Wake up," because he thought he was sleeping. And at that moment also, the priest had said to Mariana, if you're not gone, I command you to wake up now. And then Mariana woke up in virtue of obedience, and the first thing she said was, "Why did you send Fra Diego away? We were talking." So he's also a testimonial. And Father Pereira would have used whatever testimonials were laid down in order to put these things in his book. So also, just some more background. The Franciscan Conceptionists were founded in 1484 by St. Beatriz de Silva. Quito itself was established in 1534. The first parish was the cathedral, although it did not become the cathedral until 1545, so 11 years later. And the first convent in the city was that of the Franciscans. If the city was founded the colony was founded in 34, it was pretty much at that moment or a year later that the foundations were already laid for the Franciscans. They would have been the ones to accompany the Spanish in making this settlement. The foundresses arrive in 1575. They are 13. They are not religious. That's one of the mistakes. One, I think even the book stresses the fact that they were all virgins. They were not virgins, all of them. In fact, Mother Maria Taboada, the first abbess, her son was Dominican provincial later on. So a couple of them were widows. Others, like Mariana herself, she was 13 years old. She was not canonically legal to enter the novitiate. So she and another certainly weren't sisters. And the others, from the Book of Professions, we can see who professed in 1577. There was also a mistake saying that these sisters came from a convent in Spain. It's a mistake because that convent wasn't even founded yet. So the foundresses arrive in 1575. The property was donated for the foundation and was being worked to prepare. After a lot of delay, the foundation happened in 1577. The bishop had been absent during that time, and the Franciscans proceeded with the foundation without him, which caused a bit of a rift. The bishop wasn't so happy about it. But as a side note, we could say then that it was a Franciscan foundation, not a diocesan foundation. And as a result, the initial jurisdiction, right from the beginning, was to the Franciscan friars. They are the ones who had control over the convent. Now, you remember in the story, as the years go by with this, as I said today, one of the viceroys was commanded by the king to give 1,000 pesos, I don't know how much that was back then, to give 1,000 pesos every year for 10 years to see to the stability and the financial, just the livelihood of the sisters. And the reason why that was commanded to be given is because they said by 1586 there was already over 100 sisters. So that's 8-9 years after the foundation, there were already that many sisters. And it might explain also why it's possible to actually have a large group of rebellious sisters when just 8 years earlier there were 13 of them. Well, how big of a rebellious group could there be in just 8 years? If they had over 100 sisters at that time, by 1586, that's when the turmoil started to happen within the convent. You remember me mentioning the rebellious leader, La Capitana, as she was called in the book. It's possible that, she had quite the following. And the writer suggests that it did have something to do with those that were Spanish-born and those that were not. We don't know the numbers on something like that, but we can well imagine as a Spanish colony, it wasn't 5 Spaniards and 10,000 Indians. I'm sure that there were a lot of Spaniards around. Even for decades, there were probably still Spanish blood, even though native born, entering into the convent. And there probably would have been a mix as well, where there were a Spanish man or a Spanish woman with a native counterpart. But in any case, the author does suggest that one of the reasons for the strife was this division between the Spanish and the native. In any case, as that turmoil developed, and it was probably almost 15, 20 years of a really contentious time within the convent, a really unstable and unsettling time, what eventually happens is that the bishop would have to make recourse to the bishop, and as a result, he would take the jurisdiction over that convent to himself. So the Franciscans will no longer have jurisdiction. The Franciscan provincial will not be their superior. Instead, I am taking it, and now I have jurisdiction over this convent, and I am the ultimate one here to be answered to. And just so you know, there is a prophecy in the books that the jurisdiction would be returned to the Franciscans, which that has not happened yet. And believe it or not, it says that it would be the prelate who would be responsible for it. For those of you who know that reference. All right, so upon arrival in the monastery in 1577, those who were ready made their profession. They probably started their novitiate 2 years earlier. That way, when the foundation came, they were able a week later to make their professions. Mariana was 13 years old. she needed to be 15 in order to start. You remember St. Teresa of Lisieux, for example, needing to be 15 in order to start the novitiate, and she would have professed at 17 years old in 1579. She is, however, one of the original group of women that started in 1575, the bringing together of these women in order to start this foundation. I imagine that it would have been very similar to the foundation that just happened in Silver City for the Benedictine contemplatives. You had a handful of women. They were lay women, and they came, and then a foundation was made. I imagine that's how this foundation was. One of the reasons it's said why Maria Taboada was the first abbess is because she had some relationship, maybe a distant relation, to the royal family, to the king. All right, now regarding the book of Father Pereira, looking at the different testimonials that went into it, looking at the different sources that went into it, what was available to him in order to put this book together, we still have to understand the background of what we have. He wrote in 1790. We do not know how many copies were made. It would be reasonable that the Franciscans had one, and probably also the Conceptionists had a copy, and maybe a couple other houses. To be honest, there are efforts today, currently, to find in the oldest libraries in this city if there are other manuscripts of this book. Because what we have today is not the original manuscript. Garcia Moreno had a hand. Remember, Garcia Moreno, he died in 1875, which is less than 100 years after Father Pereira wrote the book. But nonetheless, he had a copy. It's said that there were actually 3 copies available. And he somehow came by one of them, and he read the work, and he was impressed with it. One of the reasons, if the story is true, why I would venture to say that the original 1790 version is slightly different than what we have is because Garcia Moreno was impressed with it. Father, what do you mean? Do you mean that what we have today is not really so impressive? It's kind of written in a foo-foo sentimental style, and I just can't imagine Garcia Moreno being that impressed with a foo-foo sentimental style. Nonetheless, it's possible. We'll dig a little further. So he had this work, he was impressed with it, and he had his copy packaged up and was going to send it to Pius IX. Pius IX and himself were close. Pius IX appreciated Garcia Moreno probably more than any other statesman of the day. They were, even though they didn't see each other, I'm not even sure if he actually physically met Pius IX, but they exchanged many letters back and forth. They were very close. Garcia Moreno was regarded as a favorite son and a true Catholic statesman by Pius IX. So Garcia Moreno was going to mail his copy of the Admirable Life of Mariana of Jesus to Pius IX with a little note in there that says, "Dear Holy Father, I was deeply impressed by this work. Could you please look into her beatification?" Garcia Moreno was assassinated, and the package was never mailed. Some years later, when going through the personal effects, Garcia Moreno was married, and his widow would have to go through his personal effects eventually. And he was also good friends with a certain lawyer. So the lawyer and the widow, they went through the personal effects. The lawyer, by the way, may have been one of the ones involved with keeping the body of Garcia Moreno hidden. So they would go through these things. And the lawyer brought his daughter to help. The daughter's name was Clotilda. When Clotilda saw the package, and she looked in these things, and she thought, wow, it must have been the grace of God working. She must have had some interest even for the religious life, because she asked, can I have these things? I'd like to read through them. This is the life of a sister, a religious of this city. I'd like to read that. And so the widow's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. You can have it. So she read through it, Clotilda. She was very impressed by it. But then she went to ask her spiritual director what he thought. And the spiritual director was not that impressed. In fact, he told her to burn it. Now, we can go through a few reasons why he may have said to burn it. He did say burn it. Why he said, what was the reason? Maybe because the style. He didn't like the style. He thought it was a very sentimental work. And that kind of sentimentality can tend to cloud the objectiveness of the actual events. It may augment the stories a bit. It may lead to a certain kind of exaggeration. And I can say that's true. As a priest, when someone hands me something, oh, Father, wouldn't you like to read this? And I start going through it, and I'm like, chuck that out. I don't want to waste my time. So maybe that was his reaction. Or maybe because the visions were unknown at the time. That is one of the things that Mariana said. Things would be hidden and things would go unknown. And my life won't be known. And Maria del Buen Suceso, she won't be known either. All this stuff will be just pages that have been ripped out of the book and hidden in a drawer somewhere, and nobody knows about them. And so maybe he finds this thing, and it's a, who's this? Oh my gosh, this is unknown. It's got no backing. It's garbage. Get rid of it. Or maybe it's because what was actually foretold that would happen to the church, maybe it was just too unbelievable. You can imagine some of these apparitions, for example, La Salette, Rome would become the seat of the Antichrist. The bishop immediately dismisses it. You're out of your mind. Get rid of that junk. This is not authentic. Maybe that happened, where the director looked at it and said, this is just too much. Come on. That can't happen to the church. The church is indefectible. What do you think's going on here? Maybe that was the reason. But nonetheless, Clotilda, she did ask, okay, there's some things in here that I really like that I thought were good for my prayer. Can I take some notes on some various things? I'm going to do some shorthand on some various things that impressed me. And obviously she'd have her memory of other things as well. And so the director said, yeah, we don't know how much she actually took note of. We don't know how much. Clotilda, she enters the monastery and takes the name in religion of Mariana of Jesus Vorella. And she does actually become, later on, abbess of the monastery. The abbesses there keep a 3-year term, and they can be chosen for a number of terms in succession. So what then will happen? She will reconstruct the book according to what her notes say, what she remembers when she read it the first or second time, what things were impressive to her. But it'll be reconstructed according to her memory. And she did make a sworn testimony that, yes, I am writing these things as accurately as I can remember. She swore to the accuracy as best as could be remembered. And this was a handwritten thing. When she reconstructed this book, it's not like she got on her typewriter or her MacBook and just, sped it out and there it is. It was a handwritten document. You wonder what kind of binding it had? Is it possible that pages would go missing? A handwritten document. And just like in the early years of the church with the epistles of St. Paul that were passed around from church to church, handwritten, through time as copies deteriorate and they would be rewritten, was there a potential of adding things, stories? Yes, there was. Was there also the possibility that the sentimental style came in here? I mean, you're leaving the reconstruction of the book and then the subsequent recopying of the book, no offense, ladies, to women. They are more sentimental than men. Was there that possibility? Surely there was. Now, it might be noted that the different sister convents which exist in this country, in Cuenca and Otavalo, they also have handwritten manuscripts. I've seen the handwritten manuscripts. But they are not identical. One would think that, we have a handwritten manuscript from Quito, we have a handwritten manuscript from Cuenca, we have a handwritten manuscript from Otavalo, which were kind of shared out seemingly from the same place, and yet they are not identical. And all of them say at the beginning, this is accurate to the original. And then some wonder why the process of beatification stalled. Because when you begin a process of beatification, there are certain things that need to be set right. And if they are not ascertainable, the process will be stalled. Moreover, the version that we have currently, the one that is translated by Marian Horvat, came from a Portuguese translation. Father, what are you saying? Well, I'm saying that the original reconstruction was from someone's memory. She swore that she was true to her memory, but maybe she didn't remember everything. She's still not breaking her oath. And the subsequent manuscripts that were handwritten, maybe they weren't so faithful. They're not even agreeing on everything. So that's a problem. Then the version that we have today, the expression lost in translation, is that possible? Yes, it is. We don't know who that translator was. Well, I don't anyway. Who put it into Portuguese. But that's the version that Marian Horvat used when translating it into English. And that's what we have today. So we shouldn't read it like it's the Bible. And we shouldn't read it like it's a textbook, like for a science class, where we expect the accuracy of formulas and all of this type of stuff. We should read it with a certain realization that maybe some events are a bit slanted. Maybe this was a story that was added. Maybe that was lost in translation. maybe this wasn't faithful to the actual event because it couldn't be remembered as it was originally written. We should have that understanding. Maybe dates are messed up, maybe circumstances are messed up, maybe persons are messed up. So am I telling you that we should be skeptics about the content? No, I'm not saying that exactly. But we do know of mistakes when compared to the documents within the archives. But I would say that there are things that are really not so essential for the story. Do we need to focus on the sensational stuff, for example? I don't think so. Personally, I tend to put more importance on details that could not have easily been made up. You know, for example, in the apparitions of Our Lady, it seems that that would be one of the things that Mariana of Jesus Vorella would have been very impressed by when reading the original manuscript. And maybe those are the things that she actually took notes on, that she would be much more accurate because those were the words of Our Lady. I mean, if I had an apparition and then I was going to write down the exact things that she said, and then later on tell a few stories of the things leading up and tell a few stories of the things leading around, and then the reactions of these types of people, if I was going to write down any kind of notes of the things that I exactly wanted to remember, certainly it would be the words of Our Lady. So maybe I would look for things like that. For example, the situation in the church in the 20th century, following a progressive explanation of how every single sacrament is going to be affected during this time of crisis. That seems to be quite logical. That seems to be a very important content that we would focus on. I tend to give much more importance to those types of details rather than other things. For example, some people would be like, oh yeah, Mariana of Jesus, she's a great saint. Did you know she died 3 times? Whoa. It's like, who cares? I mean, yes, it's sensational. And I understand that we have this craving for the sensational. We're like what St. Paul says, you know, we need to see signs and wonders. It's a great story of one of the kings of France. I think it was, somebody can correct me later on, one of the kings of France, but during benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, Jesus appeared above the monstrance on the altar, and everybody in the little chapel saw it. And so they came running, Your Majesty, this is unbelievable. You got to come in and see it. Jesus has appeared above the monstrance. The Holy Eucharist is there, and Jesus is right above it, and everybody sees him. And he answered, I don't need to go see it. I already believe. Not many of us would do that, that's for sure. But importance on details that seem to matter, that seem to relate more to the story, and what is the essential message. What is the essential message? Which, I have the faith. I know that the sensational things are certainly possible. But I'm not going to be measured by my acceptance or not acceptance of them. It's one of the reasons why when apparitions happen, they're usually subject to a whole series of theological scrutinies. Not only the content, but also the one whom Mary appeared to. Like the children at Fatima, they were kind of raked through the coals because no one believed them.
Lucia told you about the vision?
Lucia, the vision?
What a wonderful thing. Our children chosen by the Holy Mother herself.
The Holy Mother?
A lady in a cloud. Who's making up these silly stories? Tell your aunt and uncle you put this nonsense in Josita's head.
Give her a chance.
Tell them I said you saw no lady. Tell them you lied.
I didn't lie, Mama. It's the truth.
Truth, or I'll teach you the truth.
And Bernadette, she was kind of raked through the coals as well.
What's your name?
Soubel, Bernadette.
Do your parents believe this story of yours?
No, monsieur. I don't think they do.
And yet you expect me to believe when your own parents don't? If your lady were real, wouldn't other people see her too?
I don't see why they can. She's there.
Because the initial reaction when someone says, "Oh yeah, the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to me," the initial reaction is, "Were you on drugs?" Or when someone says, "Oh yeah, that person's possessed by the devil," our initial reaction is, "No, they're actually out of their mind."
She doesn't need a priest, she needs a shrink.
Those are the initial reactions. So just remember, when you tell a priest that I saw the Blessed Virgin Mary, he's thinking in his head, you have been on drugs, or you've been smoking something, or you're crazy, or you're schizophrenic and you have 20 personalities, something like that. That's usually what we think. So if you want to save yourself the trouble, just don't tell us. All right? So what is the real story here? It's one of the things that I've hopefully tried to impress with these series of conferences. First of all, starting with the name, the title, María del Buen Suceso de la Purificación, and highlighting the importance of that word at the end, Purification. And then later on, the next day, giving an explanation of the purification, because it has very much to do with the essential story. And people never think that way. Oh, what is Our Lady of Good Success anyway? Oh yeah, she prophesied that everything would go down the tubes during the 20th century. That's what it's all about. It's not what it's all about. I would say that this story is more about hope than it is about discouragement and desolation and ruins. The name of Our Lady, the meaning behind the purification, which is one of offering and sacrifice, entering then into the religious life, what is its value, especially considering offering, and why Our Lady chose to become a religious, why she was anointed as abbess, why she took a name in religion, why she was vested with the cord of St. Francis, why she carries the crozier and the keys of the convent. Is that just some sentimental twist like, oh yes, Mary's one of us now, we can feel good about ourselves? Or did she actually do it for a reason? And that reason has everything to do with the events that we are living today. And then looking at what it means to be a victim and why Mariana was so great. It wasn't because, oh yeah, she saw Mary, she's awesome. But it was because of the life in religion that she lived, which is what Our Lady of Buen Suceso showed her. Saying that, I will attempt in the next conference to go through some of the specific elements of the life of Mariana. Some of them will be sensational in detail. But hopefully I will link them to where it's not about her, but it's for the sake of something else. You know, you think of the grace of the priesthood for those of us who are priests. You know, why did I become a priest? Well, hopefully I can save my soul, but is that what the priesthood's about? No. The priesthood's about saving your souls. It's a social sacrament. It doesn't exist for an individual. It exists for everybody in the mystical body of Christ. It's not for me. It's for everybody else. And we can look at some of these details of Mariana's life and have the same type of application, that these things existed for the sake of others. And that will keep a proper perspective. We're going to approach the topic of Mariana's life. In beginning with this, I'd like to just make a quotation of St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians when he was talking about the diversities of graces.